Hello, this is Simbava, joining you from the backyard, here today to talk about how to lead a mystical meditation trip. So, first of all, what is a mystical meditation trip? This is something that me and my Sangha have been doing for decades now, where we take a group of students to what we call a place of power. This is a place in nature where there's a natural reverberation, a natural amplification for meditation. And there's a very special art for curating, leading, planning a trip like this. So in today's video, I wanted to break down the 7 steps that I take when I lead a mystical meditation trip in hopes that it'll make your next mystical meditation trip even better. So let's dig into this. So the first thing, and the number one most important thing in leading a mystical meditation trip, is what is the dharma? So we talk about the dharma a lot in Buddhism, and when I speak about it in this context, it's really an intersection of people, place, and time. So when there's a dharma for a mystical meditation trip, like all 3 of those things have to be in line. So first is your audience. What is the group that you're supposed to bring to this place? Is there a merit for that group? What's the dharma of them having this experience? Then you combine that with a place. Where are you going to go? Where has the dimensions that's going to help this group? And you combine that with the time. When are you going to go? How are you going to fit this in? What's the arc look like in terms of time where you can bring those 3 things together and maximize the dharma? So I'll give you an example. I led a trip in March of 2022. I was the abbot at the time of a Buddhist monastery that we run in the forest of the Santa Cruz Mountains. And we were just starting out. We were maybe a year into a program that we were running there that had a set of students that were just starting to really amplify and get into their practice. So we saw that there was a dharma, me and the other abbots, to take this group, or at least a subset of this group, to a very strong place of power called the Anza Borrego Desert. Now, this is somewhere I've been to dozens of times, and our Buddhist teacher had taken us to on some of my favorite meditation trips. But this was a very big place of power. There's a lot of dimensionality in Anza Borrego, a lot of sophistication in working with the energy lines there. So we knew that there had to be a very strong dharma in order to support this. So when we meditated and reflected on it, we saw that, yes, we had the right group, people really starting to come up in their practice. We saw that taking them to the Anza Borrego at that time would be something that could elevate their practice. So dharma, check. So once we had a dharma, we started thinking about number 2, the themes of the trip. What are the things that, as we craft together a teaching that will anchor this mystical meditation trip, what are the themes that would be helpful for this group? And we started to brainstorm, myself and the other 2 abbots. And 3 things at the time that started to come up very strongly as we were kind of outlining the trip was there was a very strong theme for lineage. We come from a Buddhist lineage. Our teacher has taken us out to the Anza Borrego Desert. His teacher before him took him out to the Anza Borrego Desert. This was really an extension of a chain where we would now be taking this new group out to the Anza Borrego Desert, this very special place. And it shows that there's actually this progression of the lineage where someone takes this person, that person takes another person, and that's how the lineage extends out into perpetuity. So we saw there was a really strong theme of lineage and this like intergenerational teaching of this place of power, very strong. The audience that we were working with was in a point of stepping up their practice. So there was a lot of themes of stepping up that we wanted to bring into the content of the trip. And we also wanted this to be a trip of co-creation. So not just us leading the trip, doing all the teaching, and then we have an audience that's passive and receiving that. We wanted the audience to actually play a part in this trip that we did in some of the actual prep and execution of the trip that I'll talk about later. So we have our dharma, we have our themes, so we know the ingredients that we're using to make the meal. Now we actually put that into an outline and a step that I like to call the arc. So we have these themes, but how do we put that together and how do we craft that over a multi-day sequence to hit the best? And I'm a musician, so I oftentimes think about this in music terms. Like you have a part in a piece of music where there's a crescendo. You know, you're building up towards something and then it hits its apex and you have the loudest point where the orchestra is playing at full volume, opens up the music, all the dimensions are open up fully. And we wanted our trip to have a similar arc, right? Where we're going to start out and there's going to be a progressive build, and we have a point where at one point we hit the apex. So, taking our themes, we started to arrange and actually put this together in an outline. And how it ended up working for this trip is we wanted to start with the theme of lineage, but frame it in the context of, you know, really being a presentist, we call it sometimes, and like looking at what are we doing right now? We're going on this trip, we're doing this extension from an unbroken chain where we're passing off this really lineage teaching to a new group of students. That was kind of the framework. So we'd start the trip with those themes and spend a lot of the first night as we're setting into the energy line, really reflecting on that and just getting used to the energy. Then we have a night two where we want to have our apex. So at this point, we're going to a different place within the Anza Borrego Desert, a place that has stronger energy lines, a place that has more oomph in the meditation. So after we've sort of sat there, we've connected to our themes of lineage. We've talked about, the Dharma of the group coming in. Now we actually want to get to, in this more powerful place, a space of co-creation. And the way that we thought to package that for this group is through what we call a caretaker personality. So if you're not familiar, a caretaker personality, this is a way in which we can configure our attention to highlight certain attributes that work in a specific context. So a simple way to think about caretaker personality is, the way you dress when you go to work. When you go to dress on the way to work, it's not just the clothes you wear that projects a certain image, but you have certain attributes that you highlight at work. You might frame things a different way. You might talk a little bit different way, in a way that's appropriate for work. And it's different from the way that you might talk at home and with your friends. And it's not that you're inauthentic in either place. It's just there's a natural place where one fits together and these attributes make more sense. And we call that configuration a caretaker personality. And as Buddhist mystics, this is a really important part because all the things we do have a caretaker personality associated to them where we can learn and embody those qualities together. So caretaker personality, very important theme. And as we thought about co-creation, what we thought would be a really good apex for this trip was that we can use this trip to basically take this group, go to this very strong place of power, and actually co-create a caretaker personality together. And this is something we had done maybe some similar kind of things on other trips, but never quite in this configuration. So it was cool because it kind of felt like a remix. It's doing things where we've had different focuses in place of power, but it's kind of combining them in a new way and giving a way to give a different perspective on something that is very cool and important to us, caretaker personality. So we had the seeing that our arc was going to end with a co-creation of a new caretaker personality. And we called that the Bodhan Yogi caretaker personality. At the time, we were talking about in martial arts, a Bodhan is a black belt candidate. So it's a good imagery of someone who's really stepping up in their practice. And in a similar way that it represents a martial artist stepping up in their commitment to like, okay, now I'm going to go get a black belt. So Bodhan, that's the martial arts term. And then yogi, which is what we practice, karma yoga. So someone who's really stepping up in their yoga, in their practice. And for this group who was living with us at the monastery and like really just setting the tone for what it was to live there and practice there, this became a really good theme because then we could give on the first night instructions to reflect for the second night, like what is something that for each individual person allowed them to step up in their practice. And they were to bring that as an attribute. So each person brought a word. One person brought fun. One person brought lineage. Mine was recapitulation. These were things that are really important of each of our journeys to step up. And together we could share those attributes and then do a mystical exercise together where we actually, in the second attention, in the unseen world, create that caretaker personality for us to utilize. So this was a really cool, even as it was in the concept stage, this was something that was really exciting. And I usually follow my excitement towards anything. So when I get excited about something, there's probably something there. So we dug into it more. We started to craft it in this arc. it became really clear that like this was our apex. So we have our dharma, we have our themes, and now we have our arc, which is going to really end with this crescendo on the co-creation of a caretaker personality. So now we get into step 4, which is preparation. So preparation for a mystical meditation trip is a non-trivial and very important part of the trip, because it's not only just the meditation that we do in the place of power that's important, it's actually all the steps to get there and making sure that we keep the really strong harmony and cohesion of the group that makes that actually able to happen. Because if you have a group that's very frazzled, we didn't plan it very well, there's like too much going into it, you're not going to have the attention of the group by the time you get out in the middle of the desert. So we went into a really intense stage of preparation where we started to really map out the logistics of, okay, how are we going to get there? Which flights are we going to take? How many rental cars do we need? And we decided for this trip, because it was a small group, that we were going to have an opportunity to all stay together in the same house. So sometimes in trips they get too big, everyone stays in their own place, but there's something very special and cohesion with the group's attention when you can all stay in the same place. So we found a farm not too far away from the Anza-Borrego Desert that could accommodate all 9 of us. And we made the travel preparations, and it was just going to help foster the cohesion of the group. So we had basically 2 rental cars, we could fit everyone in, we were all going to be staying in the same place. So the type of trip that it became through that planning was going to be one that was going to be very focused on like tight-knit group dynamics and basically us moving as a unit to get to the meditation spots and to get from the meditation spots. So it really fostered kind of the environment we were looking for and developing in the themes, and it gave us something physical in the planning to align that. So we got done with all our prep, and now it's time of the trip. So we fly down to San Diego together and start our caravan out to the Anza-Borrego Desert, and we move into step 5, which is the scouting phase. And this is for someone leading a meditation trip, super, super, super important. Because although I've been to the Anza-Borrego Desert, maybe dozens of times before this, every time has a unique energetic signature, and every time really needs to be investigated as if it was the first time. It's actually very similar to scuba diving in the ocean. You can scuba dive in the ocean every day. It's never going to be the same any 2 days. There's always going to be nuances. There's always going to be something that's unique to that time and place. So it was really important that part of the trip is we had made time for scouting to really energetically connect to and feel the places we were going. So what that looked like for me and the other 2 trip leads is that during the day, on the 3 days we were there, we would actually drive out, just the 3 of us, to all the places we were going to go later that evening, and then personally sat there and scout out the meditation spots and all agree that like, yes, this is the right energy dynamics for what we're trying to accomplish here. And especially because this was our first time taking other students to these places, and these are very powerful places. This was an essential part. And it almost made it like there was 2 mystical meditation trips, because there was the one we took everyone on, and then there was the one that we had just the 3 of us scouting the locations and actually connecting with these energy lines, which is almost like a whole nother trip, to be honest. So each day we would spend a couple of hours, just the 3 of us, going out and actually like really hassling the details on like, okay, does it feel better to sit in this spot or this other one 20 feet away from it? And we actually worked very harmoniously and collaboratively on that, because this is such an important part to like really feel the energy line there, how it's going to be at that time. So we did this for all the places, and this scouting part I cannot recommend highly enough, because then you're in the place, you've sat with it, and you've connected to that energy line. So you have a much better sense of what it's going to feel like right then, not what it felt like 6 months ago the last time you were here. So after the scouting, we move into step 6, which is execution. Now we are in game time. Let's go. So a big part of execution is actually really working very closely and watching the group dynamics. Because again, it's not unlike a scuba dive where you have a group of people that are about to go in the ocean. If the group's attention is off, the ocean dive might actually be very treacherous. But if the group's attention is tight and you have this feeling of harmony and unity that extends long before you're out in the meditation spot, but extends to when you eat lunch that day, when you're driving out. If we can curate that attention for all parts of that trip, everyone's going to have a much better time, and the energy of the trip is actually going to be able to circulate through the trip much easier. So we spent a lot of time on the execution and really making sure that, like, hey, before we went out, how's everyone feeling? We made sure that we left enough downtime so that people had some time to rest before we went out. We made sure that we planned dinner at an appropriate time so that, there's not any of those things that could pull someone out of a trip like, oh, I'm hungry and I didn't eat enough. So this goes down a lot to the planning. So it was a lot of just following that. But in the execution, things come up, right? So we have a saying, me and the other leads, improvisation adaptation. Because the best laid plans, you can plan everything down to a T on a spreadsheet, but until you're out there and you need to actually make changes based on the conditions, that's the real art of the execution. But if the group's attention is good, if you have a team that's implementing that can be very fluid, but also very tight because they've did their homework and planning, then it works really well. And then the third part of execution, which is really important, is that when you're taking a group of students out on any kind of mystical meditation trip, the energy of how you hold that group's attention in the first attention is really important with the planning and the logistics. But it's actually more important to hold the group's attention in the second attention, the unseen world. So for all the meditation spots, since we had been there before, we had been there on this trip in our preparation and scouting sections, we were very focused as we were actually running the trip and doing the teachings on holding in our awareness the group's attention and helping the group's awareness and the place we were sitting in operate kind of energetically harmoniously. It's a hard thing to explain. It's happening on an unseen level, but it has a lot to do with your intention on the trip. And you also have enough bandwidth freed up in your attention to be able to notice things. Because if someone starts to get a little off, the group's attention starts to slip a little bit, you can actually do things in the first and second attention to reset the energy of the group. And this is really important. And this is why all the planning ahead of time is essential, because if you're so busy and focused on running the trip because you're not prepared, you might miss when the group's attention dips a little bit and you need to actually make a correction in the second attention. So a lot of the trip, and this is helpful having multiple leads of the trip, because as someone else was teaching, the others could be very focused on the audience and the place and just making sure that the energy doesn't dip. And you can feel it in the second attention. When the energy starts to dip, it's like you'll actually feel it down. It's kind of like when you're on a Zoom call and you just know that someone off camera is either listening or not listening. Like there's just something you can sense about it. And when you're working with a group on a mystical trip, it's very similar to have that level of just kind of subtle physical nuance. So the execution was really important. And on this trip, we executed a 2-night trip, and then we ended with a morning meditation. This went with the arc. So we kind of warmed up to the dimensions and really looked at why we're here and the specialness of that moment. Second night was all about hitting this big crescendo apex moment where we can co-create a caretaker personality together. Everyone gets to contribute. They take ownership and part of the trip. And then on the final morning, on Sunday morning, we had an ending meditation that was in a beautiful sunrise spot that overlooked the ends of Borrego Canyon. And that was more about integration. So we had experienced a lot of powerful energy on the trip. There was a big up, 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 up. So it's really important to have some downtime even on the trip for the energy to come back down and be something where people could integrate. So we had some time on the last morning to actually sit and actually physically practice integration. And it was also very encouraged to journal during that time and make sure while we were still in the place, still in the mystical energy lines, that we have all of that kind of available to us and captured in a way that what we call in mysticism is storing power. And this leads me to step 7. So one of the most important parts of a mystical meditation trip is that it doesn't end when the trip ends. It extends actually out longer than the trip. So you have to still curate the group's attention to make sure that integration kind of happens on an ongoing basis. So for us, that looked like one of my favorite activities, which is an activity called recapitulation. So we encourage people while they're in the place to actually write down in their journal feelings, experiences, something like while you're in it, write it down while it's fresh, even if it's only a couple of words. Because it's very similar to, remembering a dream. Right after you have the dream, it's going to be the most vivid and it's going to fade over time. So if you wait a couple of days and then try to remember back, you have some distance from the experience. But if you're actually pen to paper journaling while you're in the place, you have much better retention and you have much more dimensionality available to you to integrate back in your experience. So we're encouraging a lot of journaling in the place, but another important activity that we often encourage at the end of a mystical meditation trip is to actually, about a week later, write a recapitulation of your experiences. And that's taking kind of the raw information, the raw notes that you captured in the place. And that can be written, or a lot of times we'll encourage people to use voice memos on their phone, talk it out, whatever's easy for you. But then you want to actually go through that content and organize it. So that's kind of like your first draft, and your second draft becomes a recapitulation. And your intention behind the recapitulation is that you want to capture your experience of that trip, but you also want to capture the energy of that trip. So by going through this journaling process while you're there and actually going through and refining it, it becomes like yoga. You have union and connection back to the dimensions you experience on that trip. And when you write it down and when you go through that yogic process of actually refining it a couple of times and putting it in a readable form, not only does it capture that dimensionality for you and stores it in those couple of words, but also when someone else reads your recapitulation, it actually unfolds the energy and dimensions for them too. So this is really important because especially on a group trip where you have 9 people who each had an experience, it's very possible to have a beautiful and amazing individual experience. But if all 9 people can capture that and share that with each other in a way that actually contributes to the whole, you're going to end up with a much richer and much more powerful set of dimensions that are available, so that when you reflect on that trip a month later, a year later, 10 years later, you can kind of get right back there in your mind and re-experience those dimensions. So that was what we encourage the participants to do. Another important part that I like to do after every mystical meditation trip is I like to do something at the end too, to capture and encapsulate the trip in a way that will be helpful in the future. So for me, something that I undervalued when I was early on in my meditation journey is I went on all these amazing trips. And a lot of times I wrote things down and took really good notes, but I didn't realize how important that was going to be until a decade later, when now I'm actually leading the trips to those places. And I found that my own notes that I took in these places where I had these experiences made it easier for me to connect back there and actually experience them in a different way, so that when I craft the trip for new people, I have a much larger reservoir to draw from. So what I do at the end of a mystical meditation trip is I prepare usually an email that just recaps, hey, here was the trip we all went on together, and artifacts it in a point in time. So for me, this was an email that went out to all 9 of the participants, said, thank you so much for joining us. As a recap, here are the dates we went, here are the places we went, and here's just some high-level bullets of the themes and teachings that we captured on each night. And I usually pair that. I'm a photographer. I love taking photography in places of power because there's something about that that captures the energy too. So I'd include in that email maybe 8 or 9 representative pictures of the places we went, so people could also visually connect back to those energy lines. And then I send that to the group. And that's helpful for me because if I need to run this same trip another decade from now, I have beautiful notes to myself that I can reference and do that. But more importantly, one of the people that we took out and had this experience, they have something they can refer to a decade from now that actually has all this information and dimensionality. It's going to be helpful for them to pass on the lineage to others. So it's a really important part of the after trip experience. And it just, everyone in the group plays a part in just encapsulating and capturing that moment that we had together, that energy, in a way that can extend it far, far, far in the future. So to recap, my 7 steps for planning and leading a mystical meditation trip. Number 1, you have a strong dharma for the trip. That's the people, that's the place, and the time. The intersection of the 3 is perfect. You have your themes for the trip, what do you want to actually tell and teach these people that will be helpful to them on their journey right now. You have your arc of the trip. Where is your crescendo? How are you going to build to get there? How are you going to come back down? And how is that going to look over the arc of a multi-day trip? You have your actual preparation. Where are you going to stay? How are you going to get there? How's the group going to get from A to B? You have your scouting. This is now like the trip has started and the leaders of the trip are going to each of the places ahead of time and making sure and confirming that the energy there is going to be right when you run that trip. Then you have your execution. This is in the moment. As you're curating the experience, you want to make sure you're checking in on the group's attention. You want to make sure that you're planning the dive and diving the plan, but also have room for adaptation and flexibility. And you also want to have the group's attention in mind and be always curating that to make sure that the group is having a positive, uplifting experience. And if you need to make any adjustments in real time, you have the awareness enough to catch it. Then lastly, you have your follow-on in the trip, and I call this the recapitulation, the integration step, where you've put the group's attention in capturing it in a mystical way that they can reference later, but you're also, as the trip lead, curating that experience and giving them artifacts that they can use far, far in the future to extend this trip to others. So thank you so much for joining me. Those are my 7 steps for leading a mystical meditation trip. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope this was useful for you. And I would love to know how your mystical meditation trip goes in the future. Thanks so much.